The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was a mistake. At 67, you learn to give the world a little grace. Doors get left unlocked. Memories blur at the edges. You tell yourself not every odd thing is a threat. I had just returned from my morning walk when I noticed the chain on my apartment door hanging loose. The lock turned ever so slightly, as if someone had tested it and thought better. I stood there longer than I should have, keys in my hand, listening to the quiet. Before I tell you what happened next, subscribe the channel and let me know in the comments where are you watching from. It helps more than you know. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. The chair by the window was where I left it. The stack of envelopes on the counter hadn't moved. Even the folder I'd been reviewing the night before, tax statements, property assessments, pension records, sat exactly where I'd placed it. Still, something felt wrong. By the third time it happened, grace gave way to arithmetic. I began logging everything. Date, time, condition of the door, items touched but not taken. Old habits die hard. I spent decades in financial compliance, auditing records most people never bothered to read. Numbers tell the truth when people won't. The entries added up fast. He always came during daylight, always when my car was gone, always careful enough to leave no obvious damage. A professional kind of disrespect. I knew who it was before I ever said the name out loud. My daughter's husband. He had always looked at me the way people look at unopened safes. Curious, impatient, certain there was something valuable inside if only he could figure out the combination. When I confronted him the first time, he laughed, said he was checking in, said my daughter worried about me living alone, said I should be grateful someone cared enough to stop by. I asked him how he'd gotten inside. He told me I must have forgotten giving him a spare key. That was the moment I stopped arguing and started preparing. I replaced nothing. I changed nothing. I let him believe his version of events was working. People like him don't fear anger. They fear documentation. 2 weeks later, I came home early. The door was unlocked again. This time, I didn't announce myself. I closed it quietly and stood still, listening. The sound came from the study, papers shifting, drawers opening with practiced ease. He wasn't stealing objects. He was studying. I watched from the hallway as he flipped through my files, pension summaries, trust paperwork, old contracts I'd kept for reference. His eyes moved quickly, hungry but impatient, skipping the footnotes where the real power lived. When I asked what he was doing, he didn't jump. He smiled, said he was helping organize my mess, said my daughter thought I might be losing track of things. He spoke gently, the way people do when they're already rehearsing a future version of you. That night, I reviewed the entries in my ledger and realized something important. This wasn't theft, it was reconnaissance. He wanted control, power of attorney, access. A narrative where I was confused and he was responsible. Paperwork makes that kind of theft legal if you do it right. So I gave him something to find. I began planting records, real enough to pass a glance, incomplete enough to provoke curiosity. I rearranged folders by half an inch, left a note referencing an account that didn't exist, mentioned an old commercial lease in passing at dinner, and then I waited. Because men like him don't stop when they're satisfied. They stop when they're caught. And by the time he realized what he'd stepped into, the numbers were already speaking louder than either of us ever could. Once I decided to stop confronting him, everything became easier. People assume silence means weakness. In my line of work, silence meant data collection. I went about my days exactly as before. Same morning walk, same grocery store, same quiet evenings with paperwork spread neatly across the dining table. If he was watching me, I wanted him bored. The break-ins continued. Sometimes it was the front door, sometimes the back stairwell entrance. Once I found the bathroom window unlatched, though nothing inside had been disturbed. He was testing access points, mapping habits, learning how my life moved when I wasn't there. I kept logging, date, time, entry point, duration. I added a second column, items reviewed, not taken. Reviewed. Old pension statements, property tax records, a yellowed contract from years ago that referenced a dormant limited partnership. Every time he ignored the sentimental things, photographs, letters, my late wife's watch. None of that mattered to him. He was hunting numbers. One afternoon, my daughter called. She asked if I was feeling well. That was how I knew the story had already been written. She said her husband was worried about me, said he'd noticed I seemed forgetful, that I'd misplaced paperwork, that I'd grown suspicious. The word landed carefully, the way lawyers place phrases they intend to reuse later. I told her I was fine. I told her I appreciated the concern. I told her I was reorganizing my records. She sounded relieved. That night I opened a different notebook. Not the ledger, the strategy book. I began reconstructing my own financial footprint the way an outsider would see it. What was public? What was implied? What could be misinterpreted if someone wanted to build a case that I couldn't manage my affairs anymore? The answer unsettled me. I had made it too easy. Years of careful compliance had created a trail so clean it could be repurposed, accounts clearly labeled, beneficiaries defined, assets parked in predictable structures. If someone wanted to argue I needed help, they could make it look responsible instead of predatory, especially if they had access to my home. So I shifted the terrain. I moved documents, not enough to look chaotic, just enough to suggest confusion. I placed two versions of the same statement in different folders. I left handwritten notes in the margins, questions I already knew the answers to. I let the paper tell a story that wasn't quite true, and then I waited. He came back 3 days later. I wasn't home, but I knew exactly when he arrived. The motion sensor I'd installed months earlier for insurance purposes pinged my phone at 11:47 in the morning. I didn't rush back. I watched through the feed as he sat at my table spreading papers like cards. I saw him pause at the notes, saw him reread a line I'd underlined twice. For the first time he frowned. That was important. People like him don't question their advantage. Confusion makes them reckless. At dinner that weekend he mentioned assisted living. He said it casually between bites as if he were recommending a restaurant. Said it might be time to think ahead. Said paperwork could get overwhelming at my age. I asked him what made him think that. He gestured vaguely. Just things I've noticed. I nodded, took a sip of water, said nothing. That night I drafted a new document. It looked like a personal memo, typed, unsigned, dated. It referenced an old consulting account I hadn't touched in years. It mentioned a commercial lease that might need review. It hinted at a contingency fund that existed only on paper. Then I placed it exactly where he would look. 2 days later, the ledger showed another entry. Same method, same care, longer stay. This time he took photos. I watched him lift his phone, angle it carefully, capture page after page. His confidence had returned, sharpened now by the promise of something bigger than spare change or misplaced heirlooms. He believed he was discovering a secret. What he didn't understand was that secrets only work when one person controls the full record. I had already duplicated everything, stored it off-site, time-stamped, indexed. I was no longer protecting myself. I was building a case. The law doesn't care about intentions. It cares about patterns, and his pattern was becoming impossible to deny. As I closed my notebooks that evening, one thought settled in with absolute clarity. He wasn't trying to help me, he was trying to replace me, and the next move would tell me exactly how far he was willing to go. Once someone convinces himself he's the smartest person in the room, he stops checking the exits. That was the mistake my son-in-law made. By then, I had adjusted my life so completely that even I sometimes forgot which version of it was real. The documents on my table told one story. The ones secured elsewhere told another. What mattered was consistency. Not truth, pattern. I stopped locking the door during the day. That was deliberate. I wanted him to feel invited. People behave differently when they believe access is accidental instead of stolen. They rush less. They linger. They make decisions instead of observations. The ledger filled faster. He began coming at night, always after 9, always before midnight. He parked 2 blocks away and approached through the rear stairwell, believing himself invisible. I knew the timing because the building's security system logged badge failures. His name wasn't on the list, but his habits were. The first night he stayed less than 10 minutes. The second night, closer to 20. By the fourth, he brought a folder. That was when I understood this had escalated beyond curiosity. He wasn't just gathering information anymore, he was assembling it. My daughter called again, her voice strained this time. She asked whether I'd spoken to an attorney recently. asked whether I'd signed anything I didn't remember. Her questions were careful, pre-approved. I told her no. I told her I trusted her husband to look out for the family's best interests. The line went quiet. People reveal themselves when you agree too easily. The next morning, I visited a municipal office 3 neighborhoods away. I requested copies of archived property filings tied to my name. I didn't need them. I already had them. But I wanted a timestamp from an external authority. Paper is power when it comes from someone else's printer. Then I did something that felt counterintuitive. I removed the most valuable documents from my apartment entirely. Not because I was afraid of losing them, but because I wanted to see what he'd do when they were gone. That evening, the feed showed him rifling through drawers longer than usual. He checked the bookshelf, the coat pockets, even the kitchen cabinet where I kept envelopes. His movements grew sharp. Frustration. When people expect to find something and don't, they panic. He sat at the table and made a call. I couldn't hear the words, but I recognized the posture. The hunched shoulders, the rigid jaw. He was reporting an anomaly. Later that night, I received an email from a law firm I'd never contacted. A polite inquiry. They said they represented my daughter and her husband and wanted to discuss long-term planning options. That was the moment the game stopped being theoretical. They weren't just preparing to act. They were preparing witnesses. I replied simply. I thanked them for their concern and said I would reach out when ready. Then I forwarded the email to an address I'd created months earlier, one that belonged to someone who specialized in reading between lines. The following break-in was different. He didn't touch the papers. He went straight to the bedroom. I watched him open drawers with the confidence of ownership. He lifted the mattress, checked behind the headboard, even opened the safe I'd left empty on purpose. When he found nothing, he laughed, out loud. That laugh told me more than any document ever could. He wasn't worried about being caught. He was annoyed I wasn't cooperating. The next day, my daughter arrived unannounced. She walked through the apartment like she was inspecting a rental, asked if I'd been sleeping well, asked whether I'd been forgetting meals, asked whether I'd ever felt confused about where I was. I answered calmly. I told her I'd been considering granting her husband limited authority to help manage things. Her relief was immediate and visible. That evening, I drafted the final piece. It was a consent form, carefully worded, legally plausible, narrow enough to appear safe, broad enough to tempt misuse. I left it unsigned, half visible beneath a stack of mail. And then I waited, because once someone believes you're about to hand them the keys, they stop worrying about fingerprints. They start thinking about speed, and speed is where mistakes live. By the time the door clicked shut that night, I knew the next entry in my ledger wouldn't be just another data point. It would be the beginning of the end. The consent form did exactly what it was supposed to do. It destabilized him. I didn't hear from my daughter for 2 days after I left it out. No calls, no texts. Silence that felt rehearsed. People don't go quiet when they're innocent. They go quiet when they're coordinating. On the 3rd night, he came back, later than usual. The hallway camera showed him pausing outside my door longer than he ever had before. He looked down the corridor, then up toward the stairwell, checking sightlines. When he finally entered, he didn't bother closing the door quietly. Confidence had replaced caution. He went straight to the table. I watched him pick up the consent form, read it twice, then sit down as if the chair belonged to him. He pulled out a pen from his jacket, not a cheap one. Something heavy, deliberate. He hesitated. That was the moment I knew he wasn't stupid, just impatient. He didn't sign it. Instead, he photographed it. Every page, every margin. Then he began gathering supporting documents, copies of statements, the fake memo I'd planted, the notes in my handwriting that suggested uncertainty. He was building a file. That was the mistake. The law treats preparation very differently from concern. Preparation implies intent. The next morning, I received a certified letter. A petition had been filed requesting a capacity evaluation. The justification cited patterns of confusion, financial inconsistency, and voluntary consideration of delegated authority. All phrases pulled from my own apartment. I smiled when I read it, because they had moved too soon. I spent the rest of the day assembling a parallel record, entry logs, camera timestamps, copies of emails, Metadata from the photographs he'd taken. Yes, photographs carry more information than people realize. Location data, time data, device identifiers. Paper trails aren't just paper anymore. That evening I met with someone I trusted. Not a friend, not family, someone who understood leverage. We didn't discuss revenge, we discussed thresholds. What constituted trespass? What elevated it to unlawful entry? What turned helping into coercion? He told me one sentence I'll never forget. Let him act like an owner. So I did. I made one final adjustment. I moved out, quietly. No announcement, no boxes in the hallway. I took only what mattered and left the rest exactly as it was. Furniture in place, papers arranged, the empty safe visible. And then I changed the legal status of the apartment. That took less than an afternoon. The space was reclassified under an existing holding entity I controlled, something I'd set up years ago for asset isolation. Overnight, my former residence became a private record storage unit. Restricted access, posted notices, logged entry requirements. Anyone entering without authorization was no longer checking on an elderly relative. They were trespassing on secured commercial property. I didn't tell him. I didn't tell my daughter. I let them discover it the hard way. 2 nights later, the camera feed lit up. He returned with tools, a small pry bar, a flashlight, gloves. This time, my daughter stayed in the car. I watched him test the door, curse under his breath, then force it open just enough to slip inside. He didn't see the notices posted on the inside wall until it was too late. He went straight to the safe. He worked at it like a man who believed time was on his side. Drilling, prying, breathing hard. The sound echoed in the empty space. When he finally opened it, he found exactly what I'd left. Files, stamped, indexed, boring to look at. He flipped through them anyway. That was when the lights came on. Not the apartment lights, the hallway lights, the building lights, the kind that don't flicker on by accident. He froze. The police arrived quietly, efficiently. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They walked in, read the notices, and asked him to step away from the safe. He tried to explain. He always did. They asked him one question. Do you have written authorization to be here? He did not. When they let him out, my daughter finally ran up the stairs. She shouted my name like it might save him. It didn't. I watched the entire thing from somewhere else. Calm, detached, finished. Because the truth about people like him is simple. They don't stop because you ask. They stop because the paperwork closes around them. And as the door to that chapter finally locked, I understood something that had taken me 67 years to learn. The most dangerous assumption you can make is that family won't treat you like an asset. The arrest was quiet. That surprised everyone except me. There were no raised voices, no neighbors peeking through doors, no dramatic scene worthy of gossip. By the time word reached my daughter, her husband was already seated in the back of a patrol car, staring straight ahead like someone who had just realized the rules were real. Charges followed quickly. Unlawful entry, destruction of secured property, attempted access to protected records, each count supported by timestamps, notices, and his own photographs. The case did not depend on my testimony. It depended on patterns. Patterns don't get emotional. They don't forget. They don't lie. My daughter came to see me 2 days later. She looked older than she had a week before. Not tired, older. Like someone whose internal story had collapsed and left her scrambling for replacement facts. She asked why I hadn't told her. I asked her why she hadn't asked. That ended the conversation. She tried again later, this time with anger. She accused me of setting a trap, of humiliating her husband, of choosing paper over family. I told her the truth. There had never been a trap. There had been boundaries. He had crossed them repeatedly. The law had simply noticed. That was when she cried. Not for me, not for the invasion of my home, not for the months of manipulation. She cried because her future had changed. That night I reviewed my records one last time. The ledger that had begun as a habit now read like a case study. Dates aligned, entries matched footage. Each decision connected cleanly to the next. It was finished. Or so I thought. A week later, his attorney reached out. They proposed a deal. Reduced charges in exchange for cooperation, a narrative shift. They wanted to frame the break-ins as misunderstandings fueled by concern. They wanted me to sign a statement implying consent. I declined. Not because I wanted him punished, because I wanted the truth preserved. The truth is a fragile thing once lawyers start editing. The court date arrived sooner than expected. He didn't look at me when we shared the same room. I watched his hands instead. They shook, not with fear, but with disbelief. He still couldn't understand how something so small had ended something so large. That was the hardest part. Not the betrayal. The certainty that he would never understand why he lost. After the hearing, my daughter stopped calling. I didn't block her. I didn't reach out. Some distances establish themselves naturally once the illusion of obligation is gone. I moved permanently into a smaller place near the edge of town. Quiet, predictable, exactly what I wanted. I brought only what mattered. Documents, books, a few photographs. No safe, no decoys, just peace. People ask if I regret how it ended. I don't, because regret assumes an alternative where I stayed silent and survived unscathed. That version of me doesn't exist. What exists now is clarity, and in the final part, I'll tell you how the case truly ended and what it cost me to finally stop being mistaken for an easy target. The case ended on a Tuesday morning without ceremony. No cameras, no statements on courthouse steps. Just a judge reading from a prepared document while everyone in the room listened for the parts that applied to them. He accepted a plea: trespass, destruction of property, attempted access to protected financial records. The more serious charges were folded into the agreement, not out of mercy, but because the evidence made negotiation pointless. He received probation, mandatory restitution, and a permanent court order barring him from coming anywhere near me or any property tied to my name. It wasn't prison. It didn't need to be. The law had done what it was designed to do: draw a line and make crossing it expensive. My daughter was there. She didn't sit beside him. She didn't sit beside me either. She sat alone, hands folded, staring straight ahead like someone waiting for a train she already knew she'd missed. Afterward, she approached me in the hallway. She asked if we could talk. I told her we already had. That was the last conversation we've had to this day. I don't tell this story because I enjoy what happened. I tell it because too many people believe age makes you invisible. That time softens your edges and turns you into background furniture, something to be managed instead of respected. At 67, I am neither fragile nor confused. I am precise. I know exactly what I own. I know exactly what I signed. And I know exactly what happens when someone mistakes restraint for weakness. I still live quietly. I still keep records. Not because I'm afraid, but because order is a form of self-respect. Sometimes I think about the moment he stood in my apartment, leafing through papers he didn't understand, convinced the story would bend to his will. It didn't, because the truth is this: when someone enters your life uninvited and starts rewriting your narrative, you don't need to raise your voice. You need to raise the standard of proof. Everything else takes care of itself. And if you've been listening this far, subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. It helps more than you know.